I call the meeting of the Springfield Budget Committee to order. Could we have a roll call, please?
Counselor Weber.
Here.
Counselor Moe.
Here.
Counselor Rodley.
Here.
Counselor Blackwell.
Here.
Counselor Doyle.
Here.
Counselor Pictionary.
Here.
Jason Miller.
Here.
Devin Marche Duncan.
Himself.
Believe we couldn't hear you, Devin, but we can take that as a.
Microphone off. Who turns off? Yes, one is no.
Darlene Reich,
Here.
Ruth Lynn Odds,
Here.
Arthur Hare,
Here.
Paul Selby here. And Chair, we have a quorum.
I'll just give you some of the rules to remember tonight. As we begin our meeting tonight, I would like to ask members of the audience who are joining us online to please keep yourselves on mute until you're called to provide public testimony. There is one time this evening designated for public testimony and will be listed on as business from the audience on the agenda. If you are attending in person, please complete the request to speak card located at the entrance of the library meeting room and give them to the budget officer. If you are joining us online with a tablet, smartphone, or computer, and you wish to speak during the time, please use the raised hand option to be called upon to provide comment when the designated time is announced. The order of public testimony is as follows. Anyone who is in person at City Hall, anyone who has raised their virtual hand, anyone who has submitted email in advance, anyone who has submitted written comment via mail in advance. The next item on the agenda is the election of the chair and vice chair and secretary. I would like to open the floor for nominations for the position of chair. Yes.
First, a question, could we just go through the three nominations for all three positions in one stroke, or would we have to do one of these?
Well, typically we do the chair, then we pass the gavel, and then the chair will do the remaining elections.
All that too. So I'd like to make a nomination for Darlene as chair.
Are there any other nominations for chair? Okay.
Guess we don't have
Not
that.
hearing any. I'll call for a verbal vote. Say aye if you're in favor and nay if opposed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Thank you. Okay, we'll move along to the vice chair. Yes, Bill.
I'd like to make a nomination for Ruth as vice chair.
I have heard a nomination for Ruth Lanos as chair or vice chair. Is there any other nominations? The other nominations? Hearing none, I'll call for a verbal vote again. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed, say nay. Congratulations, Ruth. And then the next position is secretary. Yes, Bill.
I'd like to make a nomination for secretary for Jason Miller.
Jason Miller. Do I hear any other nominations on the floor? Call for a verbal vote. All those in favor of Jason for secretary, say aye. Anyone opposed, say nay. You're welcome. Thank you. So, okay. The next is on the agenda is the city manager, Nancy Newman, with staff opening remarks and delivery of the budget message.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you. Mayor Van Gordon, Council, Budget Committee members. It is my pleasure to begin the fiscal year 2024 budget process with you. And I was looking back at my notes I recall that my first budget message with the city was in 2020. We were all remote and it was exactly 7 days into my new job. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed or maybe, like new, I understand. That's how I felt 3 years ago. Exactly. So I just want to thank all of you for participating. This can be a long and complicated process. And I recognize that you are giving your volunteer time that would otherwise be spent in the beautiful weather and with your family and friends. So I do appreciate you being here tonight. So in Oregon, we have a great state and we have quite a higher level of process that's involved than other states do when preparing and passing the budget. And one of the steps in that process is what we're doing right now, which is this budget committee. So Oregon law does require equal number of community members that are appointed by the council, and you all kind of work through this process together. And then the budget is approved by this group. It's subsequently heard by the mayor and council at a council meeting. And at that time, they may make some changes, may not, sometimes it depends. And then they adopt a budget after consideration. But I just do want to let you know that even if the governing body makes a change to your work, please don't take that personally. It doesn't negate the good work that you've done here. It's just all part of the process of making the sausage that is government budget in Oregon. So just a kind of for example, when I worked in California and I described to them the budget process that we do in Oregon, they were all very surprised at the level of input and the number of meetings. And I just said, Oregon is a state where people want transparency. They want to know about the decisions of their government. They want to know how their tax dollars are being spent. So it's really not that difficult to do. And it's actually a great process and great training for our staff. So the proposed budget we have this evening is balanced. We are required to produce a balanced budget. So resources meet requirements in this budget that we're giving to you. One of the things that I've noticed in this budget process is people, come new into the process and without the understanding that a lot of the funds that we have in the city are restricted funds. And that means that their use is prescribed and have to be used in a certain way. And so out of like a whole, pie chart, for instance, of the entire budget, it's a fairly narrow slice that you can tinker with in this process. So, but you're going to get a view of all of it as we move through, because we put it all out there and that's part of this process. Another part of our budget that Nathan touched on is that we do have 2 urban renewal districts. We will be talking about those later. Our new economic development manager, Allie Camp, will be presenting that budget. So it'll be fun for her. This will be her first budget with you. We're having a lot of first budgets this go around, but that'll be great. So I've been doing local government budgeting for over 20 years. I was thinking about that. I was like, wow, God, over 20 years. It's so depressing to say that, but I do have some suggestions in the process that I think might be helpful. So understanding the roles and responsibilities as in this part of the budget process. So, we have a lot of material to cover. So try to keep your focus on budget issues and not necessarily policy issues. If you haven't had a chance to review the departmental videos, take time to do that. You probably, can get by with not watching them this week, but definitely by next week, I would suggest that you have watched those. They're on YouTube, and so you can, snack and watch those at your leisure. I think that we did that to try to carve some more time for process with you. So these, like I mentioned, these are part of the overall process, but budgets are really about compromise. So, when you think about it, we don't really have all of the resources in the city to do everything that we want to do or even that we need to do. And so that's where we come in and we talk about, okay, what can we do? What needs to be maybe done over the long term? What is important for the short term? So it's prioritizing and it's looking at all of the resources that we have available as a city. So in that process, I encourage you to be curious and actively participate. I know sometimes there are people that are high talkers. I tend to be a high talker. I think that's probably a byproduct of my job. But there are people that are a little bit more introverted and don't feel like talking unless they feel like they have something greater, to say. But just jump right in and feel comfortable doing that. You don't have to know everything. There's no judgment here. We're all in this together and going through the process. So I do want to thank all of the Springfield employees that played a role in putting the budget together. So, this is kind of a accumulation of months and months of work that happens on the backside, behind the curtain type of stuff. And so we have a lot of staff here that they spend a great deal of time putting together the budgets. I meet with all the department directors as well as our internal budget committee. And we review each budget by department prior to coming before you and putting the budget together. So the department directors are here. And then I also have a fabulous internal budget committee. So we're doing this all year round. This is this snapshot, but we continue to look at the budget. If we have, there are supplemental budgets that need to occur. There's decision-making and planning around the budget that we do on an annual basis. And so it all kind of accumulates with this process we're doing now. So I just want to recognize them. So that's Assistant City Manager Neil Ladati, of course, Finance Director Nathan Bell, City Attorney Mary Bridget Smith, our Human Resources Director Shane Hertz, and our Assistant Finance Director. I don't know what Neil Overyear's title is, but I feel like maybe I just promoted you. So it was done during the budget process, so it's legit, right? Anyway, so hey. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn the meeting back over to Nathan.
Actually, we're going to turn it over to Chair Reich
Okay.
first.
Well, next is the financial director, Nathan Bell, who will provide us with the introduction to the budget.
All right. Okay. Pause here a second. How to get this going?
This is the 2-hour one, right? Yeah.
Let's see.
And is there a portion of our binder that you're going to?
I know this is going to be a very high level conversation.
Okay.
That'll become very clear as we move into it. Welcome again. And for anybody just joining us, I'm Nathan Bell, the city's finance director. So the slides we're going to look at this evening are going to be familiar to a lot of folks. It's the same slide deck that I've been using for the last few years. And I like this slide deck as it really provides a good context for the environment that this budget came together in, as well as the conversations that we're going to have over the coming 3 evenings. And again, and I really stress it for this piece of the budget committee process, I want this to be a conversation. Don't hesitate to raise your hand and questions. And if you don't mind, just for ease, if there are questions, I will hold on just for this portion. All right, now there we go. So I covered this pretty well in the budget training, so I'm not going to spend any time on it this evening. So it's hard to have a budget conversation in the state of Oregon without talking about Measure 5 and 50. And I know this kind of seems like it might be my favorite topic, but it is something that I give a lot of thought to and has been an incredibly challenging thing for us as we prepare our budgets. So Measure 5 and 50 were voter-led initiatives. Measure 5 in the early 90s, and what Measure 5 did was it put a limit on the amount that property taxes could fund general government. $10 per thousand for general government and $5 per thousand for education. And that's based on real market value. And then Measure 50 happened in the late 90s, and it did a number of things. But what it did that's most pertinent to our conversation this evening is it put a collar on our revenues, on our revenue growth of property taxes at 3%. And so what it did was it now created an assessed value separate from real market value that can only grow by 3% a year. And what that means for us is that since then, we've been challenged by cost inflation exceeding our revenue inflation. Our revenues have not kept pace with our expenditures. What's interesting about this is, you know, when these measures went in front of the voters, there were a lot of naysayers. It basically said government services are going to just fall off of a cliff. Fortunately, it wasn't as catastrophic as it could have been, mainly because over the last 3 decades, we have experienced historically low inflation. Inflation that has averaged between 1% and 3%. And even in an inflationary environment like that, we have still been challenged to contain our cost and have the revenues that we need to fund those services. And I'm going to show you different charts later on in this presentation that is really going to bring that message home. However, COVID brought about inflation. And in the beginning, a lot of folks thought that inflation was going to be transitory. And that was our hope as well. And the Fed took immediate action in raising the Fed rate. However, I think we are now a few years into this inflation. It's proving to be sticky, and inflation has a way of self-perpetuating itself. And so this has been one of the challenges that we've been keeping our eye on in our earlier forecasts. We were factoring in just the historical inflation in our wages that we had experienced in the hopes that the Fed would get this under control. What we're seeing now is inflation is finding its way into our peer agencies across the freeway in Eugene, as well as a number of other. And we don't use Eugene actually as a comparable in looking at our wages that we pay, but in other agencies that are comparable to us. We had our first bargaining unit contract expire post-inflation. SPA, Springfield Police Association. We are in negotiations with that bargaining unit right now, and it's going to be a good indicator of what we can expect in terms of the impact of inflation on our wages. In fiscal year 24, we have 3 more bargaining units contracts that expire that we will begin negotiations on. And so, I dropped 4 slides from this presentation this year. I dropped the per slide. I dropped a slide that I had that showed the impact of 5 and 50 on public safety. And I dropped the 2 slides that talked about FTE reductions as well as the impact on our FTE per capita. And it's not that they weren't great slides. It's that, and that there's still issues that we're dealing with, but I didn't want them to distract from the larger message and kind of what we're looking at here as we put this budget together. So looking at our FY24 proposed, and I'm assuming this is in everyone's packet, so I'm assuming folks have looked at this closely. FY24 looks great. It's got that deficit spend of $500,000 in the red, but that's actually deceptive because if you go up above under fiscal transactions, you'll see a transfer to special revenue fund of $493,000, so almost $500,000. What that is that's our Comcast settlement that we received years ago that we set aside for council initiatives. That's been in our general fund, but it's not there for us to appropriate to use it. And so every time we do a 5-year forecast, and I know that you see this forecast once a year in budget committee, maybe twice a year at council. We probably do 15 to 20 of these throughout the year. They're constant as we learn, get more information. We just iterations of constantly revising our assumptions, paying attention to this forecast. And so it was this manual sort of, oh, we gotta pull out that Comcast reserve. So we decided, let's just move it over to the special revenue fund. It's not being spent. We're just moving it over to a different fund, getting it out of our way in the general fund. So if you take that into consideration, we've actually got a very small deficit spend and a balanced budget for fiscal year 24. We don't expect much of an impact in personnel wages in fiscal year 24. We did increase the materials and services. We have held materials and services flat for a number of years. We did a 2% increase last year, even though we were seeing inflation in the 6 to 8% range. And then this year, I believe we did a 3.5% increase for materials and service. But that's it for inflation impacting this budget. Fiscal year 24 was also the even years, our PERS increase years. So we had a PERS increase, but we were able to absorb that. The impact on the general fund alone was almost $700,000. But we were still able to deliver a balanced budget. Going out to fiscal year 25, now we're seeing a larger deficit spend. A couple things going on here. If we go up again to the fiscal transactions, you're seeing a transfer to the ambulance fund. It's going from 50,000 in fiscal year 24 up to $500,000 in fiscal year 25. You know, our hopes is it's not that high, but right now, based on our preliminary numbers, that's what we're expecting. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ambulance fund and that transfer and why, even though it may look like a subsidy, it might not actually be a subsidy. And so we'll save that for a later conversation. And then when looking at the balance on that deficit is we do have inflation coming into wages in fiscal year 25 in all of our bargaining groups. And in our inflation it's above the historical average, but we're still modest. I mean, it's not something that we're going to just say, okay, you know, we still have services to deliver, a budget to balance, and that's something we communicate in our bargaining in our negotiations. And so, but we are starting to factor that in, and that's why we're starting to see that growing deficit. Something else I want to talk a little bit about is we've, you know, this forecast has looked better and has looked worse. In fact, 2 years ago, I put a 5-year forecast in front of you, and they're then probably one of the better forecasts that I had put in front of you. We were still positive 5 years out. And, you know, that forecast, I think at that point we did FTE reductions in fiscal years 21 and 22. In 22, we negotiated an increase to our payment in lieu with a sub Springfield utility in line with our peers in terms of what other communities are receiving from their utilities. That generated $900,000 in additional revenue for the general fund, $4.5 million over 5 years. So we had taken some positive actions. But the interesting thing is, you know, for every positive action you take, something comes and kind of gets you blindsides you. And in 22, we had a large ambulance subsidy of $700,000. That was the first subsidy that we had been projecting them, but it's the first time it hit. A good portion of that was related to a change in billing software where as a result, it got behind collections. The money was eventually collected, so then we had a bump in revenue in the following fiscal year. But even without that, I think we still would have a small subsidy. And I think we're into a period now where we will have subsidies to the ambulance fund. I'll speak to that again when I get to that later. And then in fiscal year 23, we had our medical provider for our jail pull out, just decide to stop providing those services. That sent us scrambling to find a medical provider, not an easy service to find for jails. With the help of the county, we were able to find one, but it doubled our costs. So that was an additional $600,000 a year. We're able to absorb that contract into our police local option levy fund in fiscal years 23 and 24, but in fiscal year 25, some of that expense is now being covered by the general fund. And then another thing that impacted us is due to some challenging history, our insurance increased our deductibles. And we now have deductibles of $500,000 per incident within our police department. We've made a lot of positive changes within the police department. We do not expect history to repeat itself. However, we hired an actuary to determine what we should be contributing into a reserve in an insurance fund. And with that actuary, they're going to look at past behavior, run it through the new structure of insurance and determine. So our belief is that we've made some very positive changes. We won't experience that kind of outcome, worst case outcome. However, in the meantime, we can't act on that. We have to act on what we know. And so we have a higher transfer going into our insurance fund from the general fund to the tune of $440,000 a year. So sometimes it just feels as it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. So, kind of speaking back to this forecast, I think one other thing too, I want to point out that really helped another positive, our fiscal year 23 assessed valuation went up by 7.4%. That is awesome, because I talked about that 3% collar. So for us to go up by 7.4, and that was the result of strong residential development with Marcola Metals. But more importantly, it was the expiration of the enterprise zone exemption that IP had. So they made $100 million investment 5 years ago into their facility that has now come back onto the rolls. And so what's great about that is that moves the entire curve up by 7.4%. And then we project outward. And what we're projecting outward on that is 3% per year, which is our historical average. We don't have anything like IP in the future, kind of, in the hopper. So looking back again at this forecast, when we get up to fiscal year 26, this is when things really get challenging. And we're back to another PERS year increase. Additionally, inflation's factoring in through here. And I think for 26, one of the bigger issues that's hitting us is in fiscal year 23, we added a number of positions back, 8 in total. Key positions in key areas of the organization that we needed. When we cut fiscal years 21 and 22, we discovered that we cut deeper than we could sustain. It turned out to be untenable. And so we made some key investments in fiscal year 23. However, we're using ARPA funds to shore those positions up. So those positions right now are in the special revenue fund and will come back into our budget in fiscal year 26. So between the ambulance subsidy, inflation, and those ARPA positions coming back in, that's why we see that significant change in our budget in fiscal years 26, 27, and another percent in fiscal year 28. We've got ideas to address this, so it's just not all bad news. And we're going to get to that as well. There's also, I think, a couple other potential bright spots out there. One is we created the First Sight account. So that's a $2 million contribution we made up to the state. They matched it with $500,000, and then that's invested and is used. It's amortized over 20 years. So it's spread out over a long period of time, but it will have some mitigating impact on the PERS increases in future years. And that will factor into the increase that happens in fiscal year 26 and beyond. The other thing, when I get to TRT, our TRT projections for 22 exceeded our expectations. So 23 wasn't budgeted until after we had our expectations exceeded. So I think our 23 number is a little bit low, and as a result, our 24. It's not one of those critical funds that when you budget low, it has a significant impact in that, when I'm in the general fund, we want to budget accurately because we could be cutting positions to balance the budget. We don't want to cut positions that necessarily is what was likelihood. In TRT, we tend to build up reserves to fund, significant projects. And so one way the transit room tax fund does help the general fund is we transfer over 5/9 of the transit room tax receipts over to the general fund to support public safety. So I think we're going to see a little better TRT receipts, and then all our other gross receipts, things like our franchising, Comcast, Sanipac, a number of others. These types of fees don't have any kind of, so inflation hasn't found its way into, and it's a conversation that Neil Overbrook here and I had today. We got to build inflation into those gross receipts. Don't get ahead of myself. Sanipac's going to come in front with their rate increase. They're experiencing that inflationary impact when we come in front of you. But that will also grow those gross receipts that we have in the general fund, and that's not factored in. But those items that I'm mentioning, those will kind of nibble at the edges here. They're not going to have a significant impact in what we're looking at up here. Any questions?
With that nibbling just a little bit. With the increase in the TRT tax rate that the county recently did, are we, and I know it's too soon to know in terms of how that's going to be allocated out. I'm just wondering if that's in any way factored in.
That is not factored in. My understanding is that could go to some specific projects.
Right.
Yes.
I would like to add that Oregon does have restrictions on how transient room tax is spent. So it's not like we can just go, oh, great, we got some more money in room tax. Let's just put that in the general fund. There's restrictions on how it's used.
Right.
Yes. Can I dovetail on that? So if we get those funds, it allows funds that aren't restricted to potentially be used for something else if we get more of the TRT taxes. So it into that fund, if that gives us more flexibility for what isn't going to need to be funding what the TRTs.
Any TRT will have to be used for tourism related type activities. So what we won't know is, if those funds come our way, they could potentially be earmarked for something specifically to allow the county to put some restrictions on it. If there are no restrictions, then we'll have to look into whether we can treat it like our normal TRT revenues to where we could take 5/9 of those and bring it over to the general fund. It's really kind of an unknown at this time. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, if there's flexibility that we've earmarked what we want to do that isn't necessarily tier restricted, but it's something you want to accomplish. It's related to tourism and economic development. And all of a sudden you get more funds in, and now that frees up the general fund money to do something else.
Well, no,
Is that-
there isn't any general fund money that's going towards those. If it's tourist related, we've already charged it over to the transit room tax fund. When we get to that fund, you'll see that it has healthy reserves.
Okay.
We won't spend a penny out of the general fund on a tourist related activity. If we can avoid it. Yes, Mayor.
So we can go back one slide.
Yes.
I guess I just want to make a comment about this. We see this one a lot. 5 years out, I think it's not really good. So it's real that this is a serious slide, but it also, I think, says something. We haven't done anything yet, right? So as we go through this, I always keep thinking about all those other levers that we make policy, we find revenues, we look for efficient, like whatever the layer may be. But out on those out years, we still have an opportunity to influence that through the work the council does and the work the community does. The other point that I think is really important, because it's a pretty fiscally conservative organization. I don't think if you took kind of all the businesses I've ever worked in, every nonprofit I've ever seen, every government I've ever seen, if you look 5 years out, it probably looks the same way, right? So this is a normal problem. It's unique because it's got, sort of city stuff to it. So it feels unique to us, but we still have an opportunity to act on it. And that's the important part.
I appreciate that comment. And there's some actions that I'll talk about later as well, but you're right. We haven't pulled any levers, and we don't have to pull any for fiscal year 24. We may have to for fiscal year 25. But when we start doing that work, this is what comes to the budget committee, because at the end of the day, it's got to be a balanced budget. We'll make the hard choices, recommend the hard cuts. We do whatever it takes to get that budget balance. So looking, this is the general fund, and I'm just showing this one because we're going to talk about a number of other funds. And I'm going to talk about the fiscal condition of them. We've already discussed the challenges the general fund has, but just looking at this graph, it looks healthy. The revenues track the expenditures. They are exceeding, for the most part, most years, the expenditures. That bump in fiscal year 21, that was the result of some CARES funding that we received to reimburse staffing that was already budgeted for. But instead of working on our regular city service activities, we were working on the COVID response. And I think we received about $700,000 in CARE funds. And so that was sort of a windfall, and we had a little bump to our reserve. The shaded gray is our reserve. We have a target floor of 20%. We don't like to go below 20% of annual operating costs for our reserve. We actually aim for 25, but we don't want to go below 20, and that reserve stays above that 20% that entire time. But this, to make this happen, it requires a lot of work on our part. And this is a slide that I think can somewhat illustrate of one of the ways that we've made this happen over the past few decades. So this is all the general fund activities on the expenditure side. And so we've got a general fund operating budget of roughly 44.3 million. I've lumped public safety into just a single category at 32.9 million, 74% of our general fund expenditures. And then looking at administrative services essentially supports all of the activities, not just in the general fund, but in all the funds across the city. So how I would allocate administrative services is by FTE. So that public safety represents roughly 40% of our staffing. So if I take 40% of that administrative services expenditure, 6.3 million, that's 2.5 million. I add it to the public safety, we're looking at $35.4 million. So I want you to hold on to that number. So the same amount is actually not the same amount. I don't know why it's off by a few dollars, but roughly $44.3 million in revenue. This is the revenue that supports those expenditures. Our largest revenue source in the general fund is property taxes. If you look at your property taxes, you're looking at $26.1 million in property taxes. Our public safety cost us $35.4 million. Yet we bring in $26.1 million in property taxes. So if there's one misunderstanding that I hear more often in the public when we talk about fees for services, isn't this what I pay property taxes for? And if there's one takeaway here tonight, your property taxes don't even cover the cost of public safety, let alone anything else. So how do we make this work? In the general fund, we have other revenue funds. We have intergovernmental, 6.2 million, charges for services, 3.9, license permits and fees, that's covered up a little bit, fines and forfeitures. Got a number of other revenue streams, and this is a point where I can maybe break some of those down. But what we've done over the years is we've diverted other revenue streams that are probably better aligned with other activities to support our general fund, to support public safety, to support our library, to support our planning and our facilities. Just to give you an example, better aligned. One of the franchise fees that we bring into our general fund is from Santa Pac. We have that exclusive arrangement with them. And I don't have the number on the top of my head. Neil, how much do we bring in from?
It's in the 600,000 to 700,000 range.
Okay. If there was a justification for that, it's the impact that those heavy trucks are having on our street systems. Yet the money's in the general fund, it's not in the street fund. And we can just run down the list with other types of revenues that could potentially be aligned with other activities, but over time, we've slowly used them to shore up our general fund. Talking about our license permits and fees, that makes up about 2.8 million. Can we move the picture over to the left side now? Yes. Thank you. License permits and fees, that's made up of our franchise fees, our planning fees, and our business license fees. Our intergovernmental revenue, 6.3 million, that's made up of state shared revenues, which include our liquor, our cigarette, and our marijuana tax revenues. It also includes our in lieu of taxes from both Springfield Utility Board and EWEB. Sub is another one. I think we bring in around more than $2.5 million in lieu of payments from sub into the general fund. Part of the justification, again, is, they don't have to pay the taxes unless their tax contribution. But that's meant to go to a whole range of services, including, again, the impacts that the utilities have on the streets and the street right away. But it goes into the general fund to shore up the general fund. Charges for services, we're looking at 3.9 million. That's made up of our fire service contracts. Fire service contracts are interesting. We have the Glenwood Fire Service contract, the Rainbow contract, and the Willa-Kenzie contract. These are great partnerships with these taxing districts. And why I say that is when you look at the staffing that we have in our fire, if those districts were to decide to just go their own way, maybe they want to form their own private fire life safety district, it wouldn't result in us eliminating any positions with our own fire life safety services. So by having those partnerships with those district agencies, it helps us kind of share and reduce our own costs. That being said, one of the initiatives when I came into my role is we used to mark up our charges for our service contracts by 12%. And the question is, why do you mark this up? I thought we're a partner of yours. And when I looked at it, I was like, I was in agreement. And so we've slowly phased out. As their bill has grown, I've kept it flat until they eat up that 12%. And then we're at a point where it's just a shared a fire budget based on AV. And to me, that's sort of the fairest way to approach when you have kind of a larger district service area. Let's see, it also includes our 611 and 617 right-of-way fees. It's not uncommon for public utilities to also pay right-of-way fees. And it's again for their impacts. All that money comes into the general fund. We now have a portion of that, I believe 3% that goes to the street fund, but 2% we're holding on to in the general fund. Fines and forfeitures, that includes our muni court revenue. The use of money and property is interest income. And then other financing sources, indirect charges to other funds, which would cover the administrative services that I talked earlier, their portion, as well as the transfer from the TRT fund. Any questions at this point? You guys are trying to keep me below an hour, I think. All right, so I'm going to start talking about some other funds, and these are what I call our bellwether funds. These are funds that are important to the fiscal health of this organization. And it's part of the budget that we're proposing here, and just to give you an idea of how each of these funds are doing. Transit room tax fund. This is a healthy fund. The transit room tax fund was impacted by COVID, and you can see that in fiscal years 20 and 21. It had an immediate impact on this fund. You see the dip in reserve as well. However, coming out of COVID, fiscal year 22, there was this pent up, I think, interest for travel and hospitality, and it just went right back up. And what's interesting is at first we were like, oh, fiscal year 22 had the Olympic trials. And no, that happened in July. So that would have shown up in fiscal year 23. As I mentioned earlier, fiscal year 23, our budget was low. This is a budget we don't always go and revise later on. And just let it be said at the time of budget adoption, fiscal year 23, we expect kind of flatline there across. So a little boost in revenue there. Again, this is important to the fiscal health of the general fund because we transfer 5/9 of these revenues over to the general fund in support of public safety. This is a fund, if you look at the expenditures, we try to keep them low. Our goal here is to build up reserves and then use this for one-time special projects. That bump in expenditure that you see in fiscal year 20 and 21, that was the purchase of the property where the flame sculpture is. As well as contributions towards the Olympic trials. Our building safety fund. This is another healthy fund right now. Fiscal year 14 dropped off. If you saw fiscal year 14, our reserves hit zero. In fact, we were this is what I call our feast or famine fund because development is cyclical. And you want to build up reserves to get you through those downturns. And we had a downturn over the recession, and we bottomed out in fiscal year 14 to where we had to negotiate. There's a minimum staffing you need to do all the types of inspections you're required to do. And to keep that level of expertise, we couldn't lay off an FTE or we'd lose a function. And so we negotiated with the union a reduction to 75% of, but we never had to pull the trigger on that. The funds turned around and it's just been a steady climb since. But you look at that and you're like, wow, again, you never know what the future holds. These are funds that are restricted in how they are used by the state. So these are not funds that we can use for any other purposes as defined by the state. Our street operating fund. This has been one of our challenging funds. And back during the recession, we had to cut our operations staff to a bare minimum. And one of the results of that was we stopped our preservation activities. That's problematic because it's better to maintain and maximize the life of an asset than just let it decay and replace it at full capital cost. So it's been a priority of ours to somehow restore those activities. With HB 2017, that resulted in additional gas tax dollars and vehicle registration dollars coming down from the state. And with that money, we made an investment in 7 FTE to restore our crack sealing and slurry seal program. And you know, there might be an opportunity for Brian Conlon, the Director for Operations, to talk about that sometime in the next couple of evenings. I think looking at this fiscal year 24 is the last year of, I think, a 2-cent increase in the gas tax that's going to come down from the state. At that point, we expect our revenues for the most part to flatline, but our expenditures to continue to grow by inflation. And what that could result in is in the future, if we don't find another solution for our street operating fund, that we may have to make reductions again, most likely through attrition, but we may have to make reductions to staffing in the future. Yes.
So the street operating fund is the repairs and such of the street. I know this is kind of like an issue for me that's really near and dear to my heart. And just hypothetically, with the street, the road bond that we have that's expiring that may potentially begin again, is there a potential to lump in $1 million in that would be specifically for street operating fund in addition, you know, as part of the whole, because it's going to help prevent in the long run these complete repairs that we're having to do, the complete reconstructions and what have you of these roads that are deteriorating. So I'm just curious.
So I've heard in conversations the possibility of dedicating some money to crack and slurry sealing. And honestly, they're going to bring in front of you a list of options of what you could use that money for when we go out to do another street bond. And it's going to be up to the council to make that decision. Yes.
Question, all of these electric cars, is anyone gonna tax those because they're not burning as much gas? I mean, is there any thought about taxing where they're plugging them in, these stations?
Well, so the vehicle registration captures something. And I think what I've heard, and they haven't gone there yet, and if there's anybody else who's more in tune with this, is you can install devices that track mileage. So instead of having a gas tax that's paid at the pump, we could have some sort of mileage fee. How that's going to be collected, I don't know, but that is a consideration that will completely change the funding structure for our street operations.
So
Excuse me.
I can add something to that, like out of all the transportation policy committees that the city sits on, that fact is a very common thing. And like we discuss what we do, you know, anywhere from, you know, tracking mileage all the way through, you know, registration fees. It's definitely on people's radar for the out years as we see more electors.
So that would come more from the state. Is that right?
And one of the, I'm going to get to a slide that's going to talk about options we have to address this. legislative policy change, one of those, and so we'll talk about that later. Local sewer operating fund, and I have another one for the storm operating fund, and so I'm going to kind of think of these as being addressed together. This slide's a little busier because, you know, in addition to the green line for revenue, the solid red for operating expenditures, and the gray for shading, there's some more stuff happening in these two funds. One of them is debt service, which is the dotted red line, and the other is the capital expenditures, which is, I'm sorry, the debt service is the dashed red line, and the capital expenditures is the dotted red line. So that spike you see in the dash red line and the revenue, that was a bond refunding. And then if you look at the dotted red line, you can see that jump in fiscal year 23 and 24. That's because when we budget capital expenditures, we tend to budget the entire capital project, even though it will happen over many years moving forward. So what you see is when you look at that, the dashed is not a lot happening in the capital program here. And a large part of that is over the past number of years, we've really been focused on delivering on our street bond and those projects. And with limited staffing, we haven't had that opportunity to do significant things here. I think that could be changing, and you would have heard that in the department presentations from those folks. That may also come up in the conversation later. Our ambulance fund. So this is one of our challenging funds again, and the reason is that it's linked to our general fund. This fund provides a service that we're actually required to provide, and what is happening here is this used to be a very healthy fund to the degree that I think it had healthy reserves and even I think supported the general fund and the services that we do over in the general fund. However, with the capping of Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, we have seen the revenues significantly decline in the ambulance fund, while expenditures have continued to grow at a significant, just with the inflation in public safety. So the end result has been a fund that has essentially gotten to the point that we've gone negative. I've mentioned in fiscal year 21 that spike downward in revenue was from a new billing software and getting behind. Then you see a spike upward in fiscal year 22. The spike upward, if that had been smooth, I think you would have seen that revenue line still just sort of bouncing below the expenditure line. We're at a point where we're going to be seeing a subsidy probably on a regular basis. The question becomes, what is a reasonable subsidy? I've mentioned that the ambulance fund is part of our first response minimum staffing. If we were to get out of the transport business altogether, which I believe isn't an option, but if we were to try to, or we're somehow able to, there is a certain level of staffing that we'd have to add back to the general fund to kind of meet those minimum staffing response requirements. So the question becomes is, if some subsidy is okay, what is that level of subsidy to where when it exceeds that level, it no longer makes sense? And that's something we'll work on. There's additional complications with this fund. I think it's further complicated by the fact that we had a vendor here in the area providing low acuity transports, Metro West. They've gotten out of that business, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself, but we went out and did an RFP to replace that vendor, and we didn't get any responses. So that's a book of work that is going to be coming over back to the cities. I think the chief will speak to this, but there's the potential for Eugene to handle that book of work. And I think there's also sort of a plan to where we may be able to generate a profitable operation on those where Metro West struggled because we can access GEMT funds, which they could not. GEMT has grown emergency medical transport funds, federal funds that come down from the state. So this is a conversation that will be back in front of council, and Chief Caven will be able to speak to too as well if anyone has any questions. Our Booth Kelly lease property fund. This was another fund that historically had been incredibly healthy and to the degree that it generated a surplus of revenue that we were using to support our general fund. Often over many years, I think even decades, $200,000 to $300,000 subsidies to the general fund. However, in fiscal year 19, we lost an anchor tenant, Greenbrier Rail. They had the services they provided were uniquely suited to the space they had, which was the large crane shed with the rail spur. They did rehab of rail cars. And that is a space that we have not been able to lease up and have utilized to the degree that they were able to utilize it. What's more, that spike in expenditures in fiscal year 23 was the demolition of the Carter building. Carter building brought in about $100,000 in lease revenue in year. So that's also lease revenue we have lost. So you've seen a steady decline to 23. On a positive note, city manager's office, which is responsible for the Booth Kelly Fund, has put a lot of energy into making sure that we're completely leased up at the site and that our leases are reflective of market rates. So we've started to trend positive on that fund. However, in those years that we're using this fund to subsidize our general fund, we weren't investing into the site itself, and we have grown a significant backlog of deferred maintenance, and that's starting to come back and hit us. Stormwater, again, I'm not going to touch much on this one. You can see a debt refunded in fiscal year 21. You can see some significant capital projects happening back in 16 and 17. A little bit in 21, and but you can see from the budget, the dotted red line, they've got some projects here budgeted. You're going to see some more activity happening here on the stormwater side. Our medical dental reserve, this is within our insurance fund. It's not a fund itself. It's a fund that contains a number of activities, but I bring this one up because it's really been one of the bright spots to our personnel services. So that's where the medical dental expense is going to show itself as part of our wages. A number of years back, we went to a self-insured health insurance program, and it's been great for the city. We have, in addition to that program, we also implemented a wellness clinic and a number of wellness programs that are managed by our HR department. And we have been able to keep our medical experience low. And the result is we haven't had a rate increase in a number of years. The HR director may have spoken to that in the presentation. I want to say we're approaching now a decade with no rate increases. We have exceeded the experience of both other self-insured programs of our peers, as well as traditionally insured programs. You know, a lot of times with health insurance, you expect it, if you have a good year, you're just waiting for that bad year. We haven't experienced that bad year. And I really, yeah, I'm not going to let on the side. I would, you know, kind of give credit to our HR department, that wellness clinic, which has been very popular with staff, and a lot of the health initiatives coming out of our HR department. That straight black line right at 3 million. We got an actuary some years into having this program and said, hey, what's a good level of reserve? That is the level of reserve we should shoot for. You can see the gray is the reserve. It's significantly higher than that. And I look at actuals when you get out into FY23 is actually proposed or amended, and then fiscal year 24. It takes off because of just we budget for a kind of worst case scenario. But we have slowly brought those reserves down, not as fast as we would like to, but we've been doing that through what we call benefit holidays. And with the benefit holiday, what that means is the employee does not pay their share of the healthcare costs for that month. And then the city, instead of leaving that money in the budget where it could be used for other expenditures within that department, we move it out of their budget as like we would if it's going into the health insurance fund. We don't put it in the health insurance fund. We put it into a side account, and we kind of designated that as our PERS rainy day side account. That's how we were able to send $2 million up to the state for that matching program. And we still retain control over another $3 million. There was a question from someone, I don't remember who, is there restrictions on how that money can be used? Yes, the restrictions on how those money, we can't go pull money out of the health reserves and use it for other things, but we can keep money from going into the health reserves. If that money comes over from other funds but doesn't go into the health program, the restriction is only the restriction of that fund level. So we can use it for something like PERS, which all funds that contribute have FTE. And so it's kind of proportionally benefiting all those funds in the way that they contributed. But that is the restriction that is on those funds. Yes.
So am I understanding correctly that you anticipate that fiscal year 23, when it actually becomes an actual, the reserves will be essentially flat
Yes.
instead of jumping up?
Yes.
Okay.
Onto the budget. We're getting close, by the way, to the end. By the way, would anyone like to take a break? A quick break? Do we need that?
I don't mind taking 5.
Take 5? All right, let's return at, how about 7:25?
Scratch again.
Thanks for putting back on. You're recording. Okay, excellent. All right, next handful of slides, I'll be able to move through a little quicker. We're getting into some numbers. Looking at our total budget for fiscal year 24, 434.3 million. That's in the first chart there. That's a big number, but I think it's also a misleading number for a number of reasons. One of those is that we also are responsible for the budget for the Metropolitan Wastewater Management Commission. And so we have a regional facility through an IGA where the city of Springfield handles the administration of the capital program, Eugene handles the operations. But as part of the admin function, we are responsible for adopting the budget in entirety, which includes the Eugene portion flows through. So of that 434 million, 162.8 million of it is related to MWMC. Additionally, if you look at that non-departmental, 190 million, the bulk of that $190 million is reserves. As I mentioned earlier, it's a budget as an expenditure that's actually locked up for future years use. So that number can look big, but it's very misleading. I think the number that typically I would focus on is, and again, the capital, that 104 million. We budget the entire capital project at the front end. Those projects will be delivered over many years, coming years. So the number to focus on is the operating budget, which again includes MWMC, but 139.9 million. And then within that operating budget, you see the personal services of 66.2 million. If we drop down to that bottom chart, you can see the breakdown for those numbers. Almost 60% of that 39.3 million is salaries. The next two biggest expenditures as it relates to personal services is our medical dental, 8.8 million, 13%, and our PERS, 10 million, 15%. So you can see having our medical dental remain flat really has helped us in terms of the inflation on our wages. On the flip side, having PERS at 15% increase at 7 to 10% this last per cycle, that can also have a significant impact in terms of how inflation looks. Your hope is if you're in a kind of a normal inflationary time, your wages, your medical, your PERS would all kind of together increase by hopefully no more than 2 to 3% annually. But that's not what we've experienced.
I've got two questions about
Yes.
this. One of them is between fiscal year 22 and 23, right? You see quite a bit of jump in the medical and dental claims.
Because that's budgeted for fiscal year 23 and 4, where you have actuals for 21 and 22.
Okay.
With medical dental, you always budget for that worst year, but always, hopefully come under. We have historically come under significantly.
And the second question is, you've alluded to the PERS question that every other year we get a bump, right?
Yes.
Can you say the number about how big the extra bill from the state is every other year that we receive? Again, like we'd ask for like 2 million more?
So when you say ask for what we paid at the state.
Correct.
So in this last PERS bump, which was fiscal year 24, we have 3 different PERS groups. We have tier 1 folks, tier 2 folks, and officer folks. Those increased by between 7 and 9%. The total, do you remember what the total across all funds increase?
Well, I
Should we
think
have it in
the
there?
best way to look at it would be the PERS and officer retirement line where it goes from 8.9 to 9.9 roughly from 23 to 24.
Yeah, it's always a hefty jump. Okay, thank you.
So now we're going to take some of these numbers and we're going to look at them now in different ways through pie charts. I mentioned the 434 million. Looking at this now as pie charts, you can see non-departmental makes up the bulk of that. As I mentioned before, that's reserves. We're going to see further charts too. I believe they're going to break these down into further detail as well. Again, MWMC is part of this at 162.8 million. This takes those non-departmental, which was the largest share, the 190 million, and this breaks it out into the reserves, 84% of it, or 161 million. It actually, and if you look at this, we have interfund transfers of 16.8. A lot of times that's just transfers between different funds. And so that's not an expenditure going out of the organization. It's an expenditure going to another fund. If it's being used in that fund for, typically those transfers happen for capital programs, then that would show up in the capital program as well. So a lot of times those transfers can result in redundant accounting or duplicate accounting. The only number here, the debt service of 10.4 million of that 190, that is the only dollars that are guaranteed to be leaving the organization and going out. Yes,
So I understood you to say that MWMC is in non-departmental.
they're in all of these categories.
Okay, okay.
So we'll have them broken out, not just in this entire pie chart of 190 million. MWMC is 71.8 million of it. It just distorts the city numbers. It's large enough that I think it's worth mentioning, just so you
Doesn't
kind of
have
have
some slice, but it's part of each one of
part
those.
of each
slices.
one of those slices. This is looking at those operating costs, 139.9 million. And this breaks it out by department. In this slide, Development Public Works is the largest, but again, MWMC in this case is entirely inside that slice. And of that 60.5 million, MWMC would make up 26.4 million of that. In looking to Development and Public Works, that's what I mentioned. There's a lot of activity that's happening within that. It's a very large department, and it supports 4 major programs here at the city: our development counter, our sewer activities, our drainage activities, and our street activities. This is the capital budget by fund. Here, regional wastewater is broken out as its own. At 62% of that capital program, majority of that capital program. Then you see the street capital program, 17.2, sanitary sewer at 11.4, and storm drainage at 9.9. FY24 highlights. This was, for the most part, a status quo budget. We didn't add a lot to it. Just looking, we've been talking a lot about the general fund. It's a big fund. It's important to a number of city services. The only addition to that fund was an FTE in our HR department for a management analyst, actually, to a training coordinator to implement a training program here at the city. I think that is something that's been talked about at council and asked for by council. This will really help us as well with our risk program. As well as, one of the things we've recognized is that in the future, kind of just the challenges in filling a number of positions, that a lot of positions, we're going to have to grow them internally. We're not always going to be able to fill them from outside. And this position will also help us with that. Along with the FTE, there's a $43,000 one-time expenditure for a performance and learning management software. Otherwise, the large add here is in our Development and Public Works department, in our storm and sanitary sewer. And I think the majority of this is actually in our storm fund, 4.5 of those 5 FTE. And this is to add operations staff to manage our stormwater facilities. Over the last few decades, we've added significant stormwater facilities to our asset list. And we haven't added any FTE to manage them. And we've had this deferred backlog of maintenance need, which within those facilities, to make sure that those facilities are operating as they were intended to operate. And I think part of last night's conversation on the user fees, Matt touched on that with our environmental permits and some of the requirements we have. And these positions will help us meet those requirements. And there'll be an opportunity potentially here in the next couple of evenings to also ask questions about that program. Future year considerations. I'm not going to touch on all of these. In fact, I've touched on some. The first one, expenditure growth outpacing revenue, the impacts of 5 and 50, PERS and our unfunded liability, the inflation. I think, and actually I'm going to back up a slide. To me, what is striking about this list is not what's on here, but what is not on here. And what is not on here is any contribution to deferred maintenance. Back in fiscal years 20 and 21, we set aside $400,000 a year for deferred maintenance. And we now have aging city facilities. 5 fire stations, 4 of them are in need of renovations. City Hall, as well as our operations site. We are not setting money aside for those facilities. Even our Justice Center now is going on, I believe we're approaching 2 decades, and we had the roof fail prematurely, and we were using ARPA funds to replace that roof. But there are also facility needs over there. And so it's one of those challenges that we have that we're aware of and we need to address here moving forward. Our hope is not, but worst case, there's always that possibility if we aren't able to find a way to get deferred maintenance built into our operating budget, that we may have to look at a bond for facilities rehab in future years. And so that addresses that item, that backlog of deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance does not relate just to our buildings. It relates to our entire city infrastructure, our streets and our sewer infrastructure. We have a growing backlog of deferred maintenance, and this isn't unique to the city. Governments across the country are challenged with this. And we on the West Coast have the fortune that we continue to grow as a community to develop. And that a lot of times we're using revenues generated from that new development that probably should be set aside for maintenance of that new development, but we're using it to address other activities at the city. The cities where they're really paying the price is back east, where you have cities that actually have they're decreasing in population. Let's see. And then I think the last thing I want to touch on here is the ARPA funding sunset, as I mentioned before, that's showing up our budget through fiscal year 25. That money is done at the beginning in fiscal year 26. And options in addressing some of these challenges. Where we'd like to go is the first 2 items, encourage smart growth and grow our economic base. Speaking of smart growth, and this is something anyone who will listen to me, I talk to about this, but looking throughout our city, you will see undeveloped lots. So you'll see those here in downtown. And those undeveloped lots, many of them have sat undeveloped for decades. They might be generating a couple $1,000s in increment. If you were to put for instance, Blue McKinsey, which is a 85 unit apartment structure that we've been talking about at the council, onto one of those empty lots, all of a sudden you're generating up to potentially $350,000 in an increment. One of the questions is what role should government play in trying to encourage these types of developments? And, the way I look at this is the lost opportunity. If you do nothing, it will continue to generate nothing for decades to come. If you do something, you start building increment for generations to come. The question becomes, at what point, if you are coming in to support that activity, does the payback start? So my focus from as a finance director and trying to find a way to sustainably support the services that we provide as a city, we can do this through, I think, smart development, which is dense development. And so that's something that I hope we'll be having conversations on moving forward. The unfortunate part of the first 2 is they're hard to influence and they take time. So in the short term, we end up going to the next 2, which is to diversify our revenue base and service level changes. The things that we're doing, I mentioned it in my department presentation, is we're partnering in coordination with the city manager's office. We're contracting with Portland State University's Center for Public Service to develop strategies to address our structural imbalance. They work with municipalities and local governments across the state, and so they see what other agencies are doing. We've never been one to try to be the leader in anything, but when something is starting to reach that point where it's sort of becoming a mainstream, kind of an example of one would be a transportation utility fee, becoming pretty common. That's the time, and we can kind of step back and ask ourselves, is it time for us to consider something like that? So with this study that they're doing, we're hoping that they're going to bring back some ideas that might be palatable and workable for our community. We hope to be bringing that work to council in a work session sometime in late winter, early spring of next year, hopefully with the potential for some of it maybe to even be incorporated in the fiscal year 25 budget. And then the last item, legislative policy changes. So one of the things I said last year, I want to say it again this year, funding for local government is broken in this state. One of the things is there's a number of sites you go out there that track the tax burden, by state. And just one site that I found, looking at all the tax, that you pay in different forms, whether it be property tax, income tax, sales tax, ranked all the states. And Oregon ranked at 25. And my initial response is that's a great place to be, right smack dab in the middle. However, when you look at the income tax, we're the second highest state in the country. And what that means is our tax structure is all leaning towards centralized to our state government. And unfortunately, what we're getting from them is not funding, but mandates without funding, which is a little bit worse. So we need to work with our policymakers. We need our peers to work with their policymakers, and we need to put pressure on Salem that if they're going to send us mandates, they also need to send us funding along with those mandates. Here, at the local level, property taxes fund city government, they fund county government, and they fund education. That's just too much. So, and this is where we can address that. That's it for my presentation. Any questions? Yes.
So what happens within the organizational departments budgets that triggers tapping into the reserves?
For them, so it's complicated. And so what we typically do is once we've committed to a staffing level, I mean, for all the departments, that's the budget they start with. And then we look at the impact of that budget. If that budget produces a deficit spend, any deficit spend taps into reserves. So at that point, we've got to decide how we're going to balance it. We've approached it where all the departments put a portion or cut on the table. We've also done it when we do strategic cuts in places, for every position that becomes vacant at the city, that department has to bring that position to a vacancy review group. We look at that position. The departments typically want to fill the position. If not for the same purpose, for some other purpose. They never typically like to give up FTE. But we look at that and we say, do we need to fill that FTE? Is that an opportunity for a savings? So let's say that we have a situation where we have no deficit spend, but they want to add capacity or there's some unmet need. We have a process where they create issue papers. Those issue papers come to the budget team for review. And we essentially look at them and say, okay, if we've got X number of dollars to where we can dedicate to some extra activities, where is that sort of highest priority need? So it's a pretty rigorous process. The last few years, the message that has been sent out by the city managers, don't even bother with issue papers. It is a high bar to get over to get that in.
So they're communicating well in advance of that overage to make sure if there's anything they can make internally before it goes through that reserve ask process.
Essentially.
Okay.
So mine was more of a comment than a question. You answered my question really well, which was about, I had sent an email in advance that said that slide 23, we see it every year. And I wanted to know, and I came across in somewhere, no, I think it was the next one, this one. I was very happy to hear the Center for Public Service research that you're doing. That's very good news. I mean, it's where do you get the money and then how do you spend the money? And you guys are trying to figure out some innovative ways of where to get the money, which is good. Especially if the state of Oregon is handcuffing you to things. So anyway, that's great to hear. And you were saying you think it might impact in potentially the next year.
There's our hope. They came back with the timeline. We're like, oh, can you tighten that up? Because we want to this year. And they're like, yeah, we can make that work. So that's the plan right now. Councilor Pichary.
So you're talking about the different revenues that we get from different sources, et cetera, what we have to work with. And I'm curious, is that our peer city has got an extra source, and I'm wondering how much that is, and I wonder how it would compare here. It's called a salary tax or payroll tax. So how much are they generating?
So here's what, and if you remember the dollar, I can give you what the impact would be if we were to do it. If we were to do the exact same percentage. And you know, the way we look at this is that we have Springfield residents who work in Eugene, pay this tax, but don't get benefit from the services. We've got Eugene residents who work in Springfield, don't pay the tax, but do benefit from the services. However, it was passed by the council for 5 years. It's going on the ballot in 27. There's no point in us jumping the gun and doing something that they're gonna take down in 27. If it survives in Eugene, then I think their goal is we'll get it in place, people get used to it, and then they'll like what it brought. And so, but if it survives there, I think we should seriously consider it. One of the things that we could potentially do is if we were to charge the same percentage that they're charging, the numbers we ran in today dollars, we could retire both levies and generate $500,000 additional dollars to support our general fund.
That's exactly where I was going, because theoretically drop people's property tax. If we retire the levies, then every property owner in Springfield will have a drop in their property taxes because they will not be paying the levy. That, number one. Number two, we would have Springfield citizens that are paying a payroll tax over there will actually see that their benefits here, because Eugene workers paying for the services here, Eugene or Springfield citizens will benefit from. So
it would also track inflation.
And exactly, we go right with the inflation. We wouldn't have like a fixed tax like gasoline. And to me, we're looking at these numbers, and I think we could take a lot of pressure off of this organization with something like that. And frankly, I would be interested in looking how they fare. I would be interested in how our pollsters do, what kind of questions we ask the citizens, and we do our own timing. And I don't care what happens across the river.
That would be a council.
I'm just throwing seeds out. That's all. Thanks.
Any other questions?
I have one. Where does the city keep its reserve funds?
In Nancy's office.
Go in my office. It's very impressive.
So we have investment portfolio, I think right now, in around the 200 million range. So we have very strict investment policy. We can't invest in anything greater than 18 months. And then we have specific percentages that we can invest in types of securities. So for instance, treasury bills, we can invest 100% into if we chose to. The Oregon State Pool, which has a much longer range in investing. We can buy corporate securities. A lot of times those are corporations and bank bonds, CDs. And so we tend to spread that risk out over a lot of different types. In the more recent uncertainty, I've been favoring treasuries over everything else because the spread hasn't been that much different from corporates. In the past, the pool was able to produce what I could do in treasuries or corporates, so I maxed out our pool investment. Right now, the pool is less, and so we're keeping the pool low and we're investing in other types of securities. So it changes.
And then as the Fed keeps raising rates and the city makes more than on the investments because it's in more conservative investments like bonds now.
Yeah, so as the Fed keeps raising rates, we've seen where just I don't think it was more than a year and a half ago, we were probably earning on a treasury around 10 basis points. That's 1/10 of 1%. We are now most recent treasuries that I've purchased, I think we're at around 4.5%. So we're seeing a higher return. There were a number of years our interest earnings were just insignificant. I think right now, again, when you buy something 18 months, you got to wait for that to work its way to the pipeline so you can reinvest it at a higher rate. I think right now we're averaging around 3.25, and I think we're still going to see that continue to increase. All right. Thank you.
Any more questions? Shall we go to the audience?
Well, I believe the next item is questions and deliberations. So it's the opportunity. Well, the question becomes if you want to start asking questions of department directors.
Oh, okay. So are there any questions or topics or discussions regarding the proposed budget? Any specific departments?
A quick comment to the department heads. I really appreciate the work you folks put into that. It really shows. I think I like these videos, probably the best ever. So it pretty much answered every question I would have had. So thank you.
I had a question. In one of the videos, it was community development. We talked about $12 million from HB 2017 for the 42nd Street improvements. And I was confused as to whether or not that was related to the levy or separate from it. And maybe I misunderstood as I was listening to it, but anyway, I was confused about that.
All right. So I'm going to let you call folks. Who is going to answer this?
Thank you for the question, Jeff Pascal, Community Development Director. Yeah, sorry, I left some confusion in the video. So the funding, the 12 million we actually received from the Department of Transportation was through legislation. And it's actually for improvements to 42nd Street itself for that north portion.
That hasn't happened.
No, we're not planning to do anything until we have an idea of what we're going to do with the levy, because whatever reconstruction or impacts the levy has will impact the roadway.
All right.
So first of all, I think it was in your video that you talked about you're really focusing on customer service more. That was awesome. Great to hear that. I mean, and the example of having the kiosk, I mean, outstanding. You mentioned a shortage of staff. And that was kind of something that came up through a couple of the other videos as well. Ops mentioned having an apprentice program. Is that something that you can do and or other departments are looking at doing too?
So we are, especially for positions that are very difficult to fill or find folks, and Nathan mentioned, growing our own folks. So one of them, plans reviewers for building, they have to have very specialized education or at least certifications. And a lot of times it just takes time in a seat, learning how to do things, building inspectors. And so that is one thing we're looking at re-engaging. We used to get students from some of the community colleges to try and bring them down, get them experience. Working on also like survey, we went out 3 times trying to find a city surveyor. Just because it's a very difficult position to fill, because most surveyors are average age of the surveyor is, I believe, almost 60 of the licensed surveyors in the state. So most of them could retire anytime. And so looking at ways to, and part of it is there's just not enough folks going into the profession. And so one of the things working with our city surveyor that we have, he's very energetic and wants to start bringing in interns and things like that. So working on trying to get that program going just to get interest in the field. So yeah, we are exploring those kinds of options.
Thank you.
Have you put together a projection of the cost of complying with CFAC?
No. Okay. I will say, one of the projections is what was it, 5 years with the staff? If we can remain fully staffed in our planning, it would take us about 5 years to complete, get through all of the planning needs that we need, get everything to the council, get adopted and meet all of the requirements.
And the timeline of CFAC is shorter than that?
I'm not the right person to answer all of those questions. And what I learned from Sandy Belson, who our planning manager, who is leading that, is she's learning every day and working with our city attorney's offices. There's a lot of different timelines and triggers in there. So like one of the areas they're working on right now that has a little bit longer timeline is the climate friendly areas and where we designate those. I think everybody focused in the parking requirement was like the most immediate that we had to get adopted. That had to be adopted by this last December. And then there's another parking thing that goes into effect in June. But there's a lot of different elements as part of CFAC. And so every day that the group dives into it, they discover and learn more.
I should probably add, I mentioned that we have ARPA funded positions that are going to come into the general fund in fiscal year 26. There's 8 positions. That does not include the 3 positions that we staffed up to implement mandates coming down from the state. So that's not even part of what's coming into our general fund. And as Jeff mentioned, the work will go beyond that. So that's another challenge of ours.
And that's 5 years if you do nothing else, right?
With those staff. I mean, we're still delivering all of the other land use applications. So we do have some planning staff who are specifically dedicated and working on all of those things. I mean, one of the triggers that's not necessarily a CFAC, but it does affect our transportation system plan and relooking at that. And so there's just a lot of other things that it affects.
Oh, let me make a quick comment here. If you're tracking CFAC, it is something that we've talked about at council significantly. It is probably the most complicated set of land use rules since we got the land use system. So like, and they're talking about a set of staff that was really hired to respond to, all the requirements for CFAC. In reality, what we ultimately wanted those staff to do was work on the UGB expansion in Northgate, gateway for commercial lands, right? So like, this is just it is a big and complicated issue, but when they say they're still learning what the rules mean, I think the state agency is still learning what the rules mean at the same time. And this is just going to be an issue that's out there for a while.
I looked at it a little bit. It's very confusing.
Well, we don't have that kind of time to talk about that tonight, so.
Darlene, I had questions about the municipal court funding, the
Thank you.
cooperative effort.
Come under.
Myself.
Okay,
It was explained that it was a cooperative effort between several different departments, and I had a hard time within the budget to see that direct relationship. So I figured an explanation would clear it up for me.
So could you, I don't have that document in front of me, what you're referring to. I talked about mental health and the impact and cooperative effort among agencies.
No, it was more that within Springfield police, the city prosecutor's office, the municipal court was going to be supported. And it was just hard to see, was it staffing that was going to perform services, and that's why it was not directly in the budget for the court. It was one of the.
Well, that sounds like the levy fund. So in addition, the police option levy, in addition to funding the jail operations, it also funds a portion of the municipal court, some police operations, and a portion of the city prosecutor. So you would have to find a view in the budget document for Fund 236 only. And then that would essentially, and you could look at each department, the police department being 051, I believe, courts being 041, and then the city prosecutor is going to be in the city attorney's org 09. And you can see how much of that local option levy goes to each of those departments in support of those services. Does that help you?
I'll find out. I'll look through that this week.
And one other question. There was mention of some ARPA funds going from ops to CMO for streetlights, 3.2 million. I was confused as to whether or not the 3.2 million was all streetlight replacement or if it was that plus something else.
So that's part of our legacy light replacement. If it's moving, what I think could be happening is it gonna move under the direction of Jim Polston for implementation?
I don't know, I'm looking to Sam if that's what we did with the street light program.
We kept operations, kept street light, all the other ARPA projects, current projects went to CMO because they are doing those projects.
Yeah, so
So the 3.2 is staying in operations. And that project will be done by December of 2023.
So all of the ARPA funds are in the special revenue fund, Fund 204. And then depending on which department is responsible for a particular project, the funding for that project would be within that department's budget. So
we hired the ARPA project manager. He's in CMO, and so it just made sense to move any projects that he is managing into the CMO budget and out of the operations budget, but the street lighting is still in operations.
Okay.
That's a good question.
Really. I would be good if we've got the whole next meeting to talk, talk to the department folks, and if we still have some folks from the county that I think are here to testify.
Okay. So you want to move on to the business from the audience?
Here we have one member from the audience, Kate Budd. And here, just give me 1 second and I'll pull up a time clock there.
Sure, thank you. Well, good evening. Nice to see all of you. My name is Kate Budd. I serve as the interim Human Services Division Manager with Lane County. And I'm here today to talk about the Human Services Commission, which is an interjurisdictional body that includes the City of Springfield, City of Eugene, and Lane County. And this body's been in place for over 20 years. And when it was created, it created a pool of dollars that brought together flexible funds to support human services programs. And it continues to do that to this day. And the amount of dollars in this pooled fund has slowly increased. But in particular, this past year, our nonprofits that are funded through the Human Services Commission have been very clear that they are feeling the effects of inflation and that they are struggling to hold on to their staff, particularly because they're not able to keep up with wages that other areas may be able to pay. Inflation is affecting their ability to provide rent assistance, for example, as rent dollars go up, as well as just to meet their operational and administrative costs. And so I am here today to ask the City of Springfield to consider, and this budget committee, to consider increasing the amount of dollars provided to the Human Services Commission. And I hope that you received a 4-page PowerPoint. And in that, it gives a bit of explanation just regarding how much the City of Springfield has provided in the past, which is around $260,000. That's made up of general fund money from the city manager's budget, as well as community development block grant funds from Public Works Community Development Division budget. And so the ask today is to consider a total of $32,525 as the increase for this pooled fund. And what that comes from is matching the percentage that Lane County is increasing their contribution at 2.8% of the base. And then also increasing based on the consumer price index. And so in total, again, that's the $32,000. There's a few other funding options that you can consider if you're looking to go higher. But what this would do is allow us to just provide, the additional small amounts in the Human Services Commission contracts that are provided to the nonprofits in our community. A few nonprofits specifically targeted here in Springfield include Mainstream Housing, as well as HIV Alliance that also provides outreach in the community. So I left my contact information on the PowerPoint if you have any further questions, but we very much appreciate your consideration. Thank you.
So do we have anyone with the raised hand or? No,
Chair, we don't have anyone online with the raised hand. We've also not received any other requests to speak cards.
or email.
Correct. Yeah, we have not received any other email or written correspondence.
Okay. And that concludes the public comment. So, we adjourn?
You can adjourn us.
Okay.